When it comes to weight and metabolism, there are a lot of different ways to look at the problem. Now, because I'm in medicine, I'm always going to look at things from an overall health picture, and certainly your overall health does play a role with weight and metabolism. Some things that can often arise together are insulin resistance, increased body fat, and resistance to putting on muscle. Insulin is the hormone that will help bring down those blood sugars after meals by putting it into places like your liver and your muscles. And so, as we become more insulin resistant, we require more and more insulin to control those blood sugars to do the same thing. And so, today I want to walk you through what that connection is, why insulin resistance can lead to struggles maintaining good weight, and some strategies that you can use to help improve your insulin resistance. But before I get into all of that, let me just briefly introduce myself. My name is Dr. Robin Lewis. I'm a naturopathic physician practicing in Vancouver, British Columbia, Canada, and let's get into it. Now, I should start by saying optimizing insulin is not just for weight loss. Insulin resistance has huge implications on our overall health and has been linked to a lot of various different diseases. But I am going to be talking about it today in the context of weight, because most of us don't think about it that way. Most of us don't think about weight management and metabolism through the lens of insulin. And for many of us, if we do start to look at it that way and we do start to investigate these things, it can be an absolute game changer for weight loss. So helping people lose fat and put muscle on. And before you exit this video thinking this doesn't apply to you, just know that 15 to 46% of the population is insulin resistant, with places like North America being on the upper end of that range. And many of us do not even know it because insulin resistance isn't necessarily part of routine screening. Most doctors aren't running the tests that confirm insulin resistance because insulin resistance is what precedes diabetes. It's not an overt disease yet. A lot of our conventional medical practices are looking for overt disease. They're looking for full-on diabetes. So if you do run things like fasting insulin, your oral glucose tolerance test, triglycerides, you can detect insulin resistance early on and prevent diabetes from ever occurring, and also know if it's contributing to your weight struggles. So needless to say, this is a very common issue and could be why you're struggling with your weight and metabolism. So the first thing I want to do for you is make the connection between insulin, metabolism, and weight. Why are these things related? Well, more or less, insulin blocks lipolysis, the breakdown of fat. So when insulin goes high, we will store more fat within our muscle. And our muscle is very important in the context of insulin and blood sugars because it's where we store 70 to 80% of those excess blood sugars. Our blood sugars will rise after a meal, and those can't stay risen for too long, and so they need to get put away somewhere. And muscles are the major place that's put away. And so this is very much a vicious cycle. Insulin resistance requires more insulin, which will put more fat into those muscles and make them more metabolically unwell and more insulin resistant. So this is the cycle of insulin resistance, fat, and the muscles. We end up putting on more fat because our muscles are full already. We have stores inside our muscle called glycogen. That's how sugar is stored, in the form of glycogen. Well, our muscles only need so much of that before they're saturated. So what do we do with that excess energy? If we keep eating food past the point of our glycogen stores being full, that excess energy has to go somewhere. So what will happen is your fat cells will take in that glucose and convert it to more fat. Now, this is going to happen whether you're insulin resistant or not. If you exceed your caloric intake, whether that be protein, fat, or sugars, I'm going to talk about sugars because it just keeps this simpler, but any excess energy will need to go somewhere. It needs to get stored somewhere. You can't just have really, really high blood sugars. And so fat is another place we store this. But the interesting thing is when you're insulin resistant, you more quickly convert to fat and you are more resistant to breaking that fat down. So when you go into a calorie deficit, you should start pulling from those stores because you also don't want your blood sugars to go too low. You don't have enough energy coming in through food, so you pull from these energy stores inside the body. But an insulin resistant individual will pull from their fat storages less efficiently. They end up with volatile blood sugars. And so this is the other reason why it can very much affect how much fat you put on and how resistant you are to losing that fat. So that's all I'm going to say to provide some context to keep this short and sweet. Let's move into some of the strategies we can use to combat this. And before I jump into it, I just want to give a quick heads up that when I go over the strategies to go over insulin resistance and how to improve it, I'm not going to be focusing on diet. And that's just because I've already done a video on balancing blood sugars through diet. It's called Balance Your Blood Sugars with These Simple Diet Guidelines. So if you want to learn more about the dietary things you can do and the strategies, you can go and watch that. So I'm going to be focusing on the other things that very much help insulin resistance but aren't related to food. The first thing I'm going to talk about may sound obvious, but it cannot be emphasized enough. It is so important, and that is exercise. And don't be worried, I will talk about more specific types of exercise in just a minute. The main reasons that exercise is so important is because it helps promote non-insulin dependent removal of sugars from your blood. What that means is you can have that same action of taking those sugars out of the blood, putting them into your muscle, but it doesn't require insulin to do that. So what this is going to mean is your insulin requirements aren't as high. If your insulin levels aren't as high, there's less insulin around to block that lipolysis, to block the breakdown of fat. So that's the first reason. And now the other reason has to do with those stores I just mentioned, the glycogen stores. So as we exercise and say we haven't eaten in a while and our blood sugar is starting to drop, we need to start pulling from those glycogen stores. The less we have in those stores, the more room we have to put back into them later when we eat a meal. So again, our glycogen stores can get saturated, but then we can start to pull from them when we exercise, when we start burning through our energy and needing more and more energy to keep running, keep lifting, whatever we're doing. That opens up space in those stores so that when you eat, less needs to get converted into fat. We can start putting into the glycogen stores that have been depleted. We have less overflow that needs to go into the fat. So that's another reason why exercise is so important. Now, the last thing I want to kind of talk about, because this is relevant for which types of exercise we're going to choose, is the fact that we have two main muscle fibers. We have slow twitch and fast twitch. Our slow twitch are more related to endurance activities, and our fast twitch are more explosive, high intensity activities. So things like sprinting, HIIT training, really high intensity lifting, heavy, short reps. Those sort of things are more high intensity, fast twitch fibers. Low intensity, slow twitch fibers would be like a hike, a walk, a low grade cardio, lifting, but not as heavy. So more reps, lighter weight, those sort of things. Ultimately, you want to burn through both the glycogen stores inside your fast twitch and the glycogen stores inside your slow twitch. So this means a variety of different types of activity. But the interesting thing about insulin resistance is that they have found that these people will lose their slow twitch muscle fibers more than their fast twitch. So there is an argument to doing more of the endurance activities versus the high intensity ones. And the rate of loss of those slow twitch muscle fibers has actually been linked to more severe manifestations of insulin resistance. So you might need to focus more on those types. Ultimately, both types, but maybe more of the slow twitch muscle fiber promoting activities, which are things like endurance activities. Now, the very last thing I will also mention And this has more to do with cortisol and stress, which I'm going to talk about later, is the fact that high intensity, really like feel like I'm gonna puke, kind of more is more kind of activity is also very cortisol spiking. So things like spin class, like really intense crossfitting, things that you can all recognize are really intense forms of activity. For some individuals, that is spiking cortisol too much when cortisol is already a problem. Now, again, you're gonna make more of this connection when I talk about stress later and cortisol and what role this has to play. But if you relate to that, when I talk about that later, about how stress is out of control, and you think that's also something you need to work on, you might also need to consider the fact that sometimes these activities are too intense for where your body's at. So just something else to think about. It all gets very nuanced. It should always be individualized, but if we're speaking in generals, the endurance activity might be your best bet, even though that's quite counterintuitive for a lot of people. Now, the next thing to focus on here is sleep, which is a very underappreciated contributing factor to weight, insulin resistance, overall health. Sleep is so important and so many of us struggle with it. And yes, if you are someone who has to take a sleeping pill to go to bed every night, you also count as someone who has troubles with sleep, because most of these sleeping pills, especially the really strong pharmaceutical grade ones, they just knock you out. They don't really give you high quality sleep. And I'm talking about high quality, deep sleep. That is the kind of sleep that is linked to improved insulin resistance, to improved weight management, and all of these things that we're trying to accomplish. And if we're defining good sleep, I'm also talking about 7 to 9 hours of sleep a night. Since the 1960s, the amount of us getting less than 7 hours a night has doubled. We are not sleeping enough. So don't kid yourself when you're telling yourself that you only need 5 hours a night. There is a strong correlation with insulin resistance and getting less than 7 hours a night. So it does not require for you to be drastically sleep deprived in order for this to have an effect. 7 hours or less is what we're talking about. And it does not take long for this effect to start happening. So they studied humans getting less than 7 hours a night, and it only took about 6 days to see that have negative impacts on their insulin levels, and interestingly enough, your appetite hormones. So after 6 days or so, they noticed that the leptin levels decreased by 19%. Now, leptin is an appetite suppressing hormone. And they also saw a very similar rise in ghrelin, your appetite promoting hormone. So not only are you struggling with insulin resistance, but your appetite is working against you as well, which is of course going to make it much harder to make good dietary decisions and not overeat, which of course play a role in weight management, insulin resistance, and all of those fun things. So it doesn't take long and it doesn't take much sleep deprivation to have a huge impact here. So if you're going to try your darndest to eat right, exercise well, but you're not sleeping, then you're also not addressing all of the things that can be contributing to your weight and to your metabolism. All right, so the last thing I'm going to talk about, which is an absolute beast of a topic and never can be talked about enough, and that is stress. So stress, I'm sure we're all way too familiar with what that feels like. And if you've read anything about it, you know that it's linked to virtually all illnesses you can imagine. So it shouldn't be surprising that, of course, it's very much related to insulin resistance, your weight, and your metabolism. If any of you guys have heard of the term cortisol belly, that's what we're talking about here. Cortisol is our stress hormone, and it is highly linked to insulin. One of the ways it's linked to insulin is that it increases our blood sugars. And so you got to think about this from an evolutionary standpoint. Originally, stress was there to help us. So you would be stressed if you saw a predator, for example. And what cortisol will do in this situation is it'll mobilize your blood sugars, pump them into your bloodstream so that it's available for you to use for energy, to run away from the predator, to fight, to get something done so you can get out of that situation. Now, of course, modern day stress isn't us fighting predators. It's us fighting people on the internet, having stressful calls, thinking about finances, reading the news, all of which do not require you to run away and physically do much. And so you will still have the same effect of the cortisol causing a spike in your blood sugars. But in this case, now these sugars just need to get put away. So your demand for insulin will go up. And the last thing I'm going to say on this is that cortisol, high stress, is linked to the worst kind of fat, which is what we call visceral fat, the kind of fat that sits on our abdomen and our trunk. It's also an area that a lot of people struggle with. They struggle to lose weight in that area commonly. Visceral fat, abdominal fat is the worst type, and it's also the most correlated with cortisol and stress. Now I'm going to wrap up there, and I know that this may sound obvious. Yeah, sure. Manage your stress, sleep more, exercise appropriately. But I really do think that a lot of us forget this when we're on a journey of trying to figure out how to manage our weight. If you've got fat to lose and you're not losing it, killing yourself with restricting your diet and going to the most intensive exercises might not actually be the best place to spend your energy. Those things are important. Finding good exercise and good diet habits is important. But if you're not sleeping well, if you're not managing your stress, you're going to have to work harder at those things. And this is all very much connected. So I hope today that you got something helpful out of this and that it helps kind of reshift your perspective on weight. It's not only about diet and exercise. And if you are thinking about exercise, maybe it's not the most appropriate exercise. Maybe the type of exercise you're doing is too intense and you're not balancing it out enough with these other forms of exercise. Maybe spend some of that energy focusing on your sleep, talking to your doctor, your naturopath, whoever it is, about how we can really get you getting those 7 to 9 hours. And then you might find that the diet comes a little easier, that the weight comes off a little easier. So thanks again for listening. I hope you got something valuable out of this. If you've got questions, please comment them below and have yourself a wonderful day.